Lee Marvin wasn't just another Hollywood tough guy. He was the blueprint. Behind that icy stare and gravelly voice was a man who lived as hard as he acted. But what most people don't know is that his real life was even more intense, chaotic, and heartbreaking than anything he ever portrayed on screen. From a brutal childhood to battlefield heroics, shocking lawsuits, secret passions, and a lonely final chapter, Marvin's untold story is packed with twists few could have predicted. Stick around, because the deeper we go, the more surprising and haunting Lee Marvin's real legacy becomes. Before Lee Marvin ever stepped onto a movie set, his life already read like a Hollywood script, just a lot grittier. Born on February 19, 1924, in New York City, Lee wasn't handed the silver spoon many of his future colleagues enjoyed. His father, Lamont Marvin, was an advertising executive and a World War I veteran. His mother, Courtney Marvin, was a fashion editor. Sounds respectable, right? But inside the Marvin home, discipline was king, and Lee was a natural-born rebel. Even as a kid, Lee clashed with authority at every turn. His schooling was chaotic at best. He was expelled from multiple institutions for behavioral issues. Fighting, ditching classes, and pranking teachers weren't just rare outbursts. They were his everyday routine. He once famously remarked that he got kicked out of every school he ever attended, proudly wearing it as a badge of honor. But Lee wasn't just causing trouble for the fun of it. Looking deeper, it's clear he was a product of his times. Growing up during the Great Depression, survival often meant toughness, and Marvin had toughness in spades. He developed a deep mistrust of figures of authority, a theme that would later become a defining trait of his most iconic characters. Adding more gasoline to the fire, young Lee found solace in nature rather than structured society. He loved hunting, fishing, and roaming the outdoors. These rugged hobbies didn't just make him physically tough, they shaped his loner mentality, a quality that would later set him apart from the polished leading men of his generation. As Lee stumbled his way through his adolescence, it became clear that traditional success wasn't in the cards. He dropped out of several schools and was sent to a military academy in Florida in an attempt to straighten him out. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Instead, it just intensified his rebellious streak. Marvin openly disdained the rigid rules and often found himself in trouble with his superiors. Yet beneath the rough surface, there was also a sharp mind and an untapped well of raw emotion. Lee had a natural gift for storytelling and a biting wit. Friends and family noticed that when he wasn't picking fights, he had a magnetic way of drawing people in, a glimpse of the star power that would later explode on screen. By the time World War II broke out, Lee Marvin wasn't just itching for adventure, he was practically destined for it. And what happened next would change him forever, scarring him physically and mentally in ways that no movie role could ever fully capture. When Lee Marvin signed up for the United States Marine Corps during World War II, it wasn't some publicity stunt or a last-ditch effort to find purpose. It was pure instinct. Lee was the kind of man who didn't run from a fight, he charged straight into it. And that's exactly what he did when he became part of one of the bloodiest conflicts in American military history. Assigned to the 4th Marine Division, Marvin saw immediate, brutal action in the Pacific Theater. He wasn't just hanging around the edges either. He was deep in it. Lee participated in the Battle of Saipan, one of the most grueling and deadly battles of the entire war. And it nearly killed him. During a vicious assault on a Japanese machine gun nest, Marvin was seriously wounded. Shrapnel tore into his buttocks and sciatic nerve, leaving him flat on the battlefield. Many of the men he fought alongside didn't make it out alive. Lee barely survived and was evacuated back to the U.S. to recover. For his bravery under fire, he was awarded the Purple Heart, but the physical pain and the mental toll stayed with him for the rest of his life. Marvin never glamorized his service. Unlike some actors who puffed up their war stories later for Hollywood clout, Lee was refreshingly honest. He openly admitted to being terrified during combat and even confessed that he sometimes questioned whether he had the courage to keep going. That raw honesty about his vulnerability made him stand out, even decades later, as a real-deal American hero, not a pretend one. But the scars went beyond the visible injuries. Marvin suffered from what we would now recognize as PTSD, long before it had a name. Nightmares, heavy drinking, and fits of rage plagued him throughout his life. His post-war struggles seeped into his career, giving his characters a grim authenticity that audiences could feel even if they didn't understand where it came from. In a 1960s interview, Marvin said something chillingly simple. "The war screwed me up, but it also taught me how to be honest, about fear, about pain, about everything. That brutal self-awareness became his signature, both on and off the screen. Interestingly, even though Marvin's war hero status could have made him a poster boy for patriotic films, he avoided roles that glorified combat without showing its horrors. In his movies, when Marvin's characters fought or killed, there was always a price, a moment of pain or reflection that mirrored the weight he carried inside. Lee Marvin didn't need to act tough, he was tough, forged by fire and scarred by real battle. And those scars, both seen and unseen, followed him straight into Hollywood, where his second, very different kind of war was about to begin. When Lee Marvin stumbled into acting, it wasn't part of some grand master plan. In fact, it was almost accidental. After returning from the war, still nursing wounds both visible and hidden, Marvin drifted for a while. He worked odd jobs, plumber's apprentice, store clerk, but nothing stuck. His sharp edges didn't exactly fit neatly into civilian life. Then, on a whim, he auditioned for a role at a small theater company in Woodstock, New York. He wasn't polished. He wasn't classically trained. But he had something you couldn't teach: raw, unpredictable energy. Hollywood couldn't ignore it for long. Marvin's early roles were small: tough guys, thugs, and background heavies. But even in a crowd, Lee stood out. He had a sneer you could feel in your bones and a kind of magnetic intensity that made audiences lean forward. He didn't smile politely for the cameras or soften his rough edges for studio bosses. Marvin was real, almost too real for the clean-cut image Hollywood liked to promote in the 1950s. His big break came when directors realized that Marvin didn't have to act tough, he was tough. Films like The Big Heat, 1953, and Bad Day at Black Rock, 1955, showcased his ability to make even a minor villain seem larger than life. He wasn't the leading man yet, but he was the guy you remembered after the credits rolled. Off-screen, Marvin was just as rebellious. He didn't play the Hollywood game. He hated interviews, avoided studio parties, and had no patience for the glad-handing culture of Tinseltown. If a director annoyed him, he'd walk off set. If a producer tried to sweet-talk him, Marvin might tell them exactly where to shove it, often in very colorful language. This defiance could have killed his career early on, but somehow it did the opposite. In an industry built on facades, Marvin's authenticity became his brand. He wasn't pretending to be a tough guy for the screen. He was giving people a glimpse into a man who had survived real horrors and wasn't about to fake anything for a paycheck. Directors loved him for it, or at least the ones brave enough to work with him did. Marvin's reputation for being difficult was balanced by the fact that when the cameras rolled, he delivered something no one else could: gritty, wounded, terrifying truth. He wasn't conventionally handsome, and he sure didn't follow the rules. But Lee Marvin was becoming an undeniable force in Hollywood. By the late 1950s, he was more than just a reliable heavy, he was a star on the rise. Hollywood tried to figure him out, tried to box him in, but Marvin was like a wild animal, untamable, unpredictable, and completely uninterested in playing by anyone else's rules. Lee Marvin wasn't supposed to be a leading man. Not in the traditional Hollywood sense, anyway. He didn't have the polished good looks of a Cary Grant or the charming smile of a James Stewart. What he had was presence, and when he finally got the chance to lead, he didn't just impress audiences. He rewrote the rulebook for what a Hollywood star could look and act like. His breakthrough came in 1965 with Cat Ballou. And here's the crazy part, it was a comedy. Up to that point, Marvin had been the face of violence and brooding intensity. No one expected him to show up in a film playing two characters, including a drunk, washed-up gunslinger, and absolutely steal the movie. His performance was hilarious, tragic, and completely captivating. Against all odds, it won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. But Marvin didn't let Oscar Gold turn him into another studio puppet. Instead, he doubled down on being himself. His next few roles in films like The Professionals, 1966, and The Dirty Dozen, 1967, cemented his image as the ultimate anti-hero. He wasn't clean-cut or morally upright. His characters were messy, damaged, and often downright dangerous. But audiences couldn't get enough of him. The Dirty Dozen became a massive hit, and suddenly Lee Marvin wasn't just a respected actor, he was a certified box office draw. Studios finally understood. Audiences were craving something different. They didn't just want heroes who always did the right thing. They wanted someone who looked like he had been through hell and lived to tell about it. Marvin fit that mold better than anyone. But success didn't change Marvin much. He refused to move to Beverly Hills, choosing instead to live a more rugged life away from the Hollywood glitz. He wasn't interested in polishing his public image. He gave abrasive interviews, spent weekends on his boat fishing or drinking, and never lost his sharp-edged wit. To many, Marvin embodied the last of a dying breed, the real-deal tough guy who didn't need to fake anything. His influence spread beyond his own films. Without Lee Marvin, you don't get the rise of the gritty anti-heroes that would dominate the 1970s. Actors like Clint Eastwood, Charles Bronson, and Steve McQueen owed a lot to the path Marvin had carved out. He proved that audiences would embrace flawed, complicated characters if they were played with honesty and guts. And while Marvin continued to make bold career choices, he also turned down plenty of cushy, big-money roles that didn't fit his no-nonsense style. He wasn't in it for the fame or the fortune. He was chasing something a lot harder to find in Hollywood, truth. At the peak of his fame, Lee Marvin found himself in a legal battle that would shake Hollywood to its core. It completely changed the way relationships and money were handled in the entertainment world. The case was Marvin versus Marvin, and it wasn't just a tabloid sensation. It set a legal precedent that still echoes today. It all started when Lee Marvin's longtime girlfriend, Michelle Triola, sued him after their relationship ended. The two had lived together for 6 years, and while they were never officially married, Triola claimed she had given up her own career to support Marvin, and that he had promised to take care of her financially for life. When the relationship soured, she didn't just walk away heartbroken. She went straight to court. Her lawsuit asked for half of Marvin's earnings during their time together, despite the fact that they weren't legally married. It was one of the first high-profile palimony cases in American history, and the media ate it up. Newspapers, magazines, and TV shows couldn't get enough of the story. Here was one of Hollywood's toughest guys being dragged into court, fighting for his fortune against a woman who was basically saying, "You owe me, married or not." Marvin, for his part, fought back hard. He didn't exactly handle it with grace. In fact, his lawyers painted Triola as a fame-seeker and opportunist. The battle got ugly fast. Allegations flew from both sides. Triola's team claimed Marvin had verbally promised her financial security for life. Marvin's side argued that there was never any such agreement. The court eventually ruled that while Triola was entitled to some financial compensation, she wasn't going to get half of Marvin's earnings. Still, the case cracked open a door that had never really been considered before. The idea that long-term live-in partners could have legal financial claims against each other even without marriage. It wasn't just gossip. It rewrote the playbook for celebrities and regular people everywhere. Suddenly, Hollywood stars who had been casually living with partners started thinking twice. Palimony became a household word. Lawyers made careers specializing in these kinds of cases. Prenuptial agreements, once considered cold or unromantic, started becoming essential. And it was all because Lee Marvin and Michelle Triola had brought their private drama into a public courtroom. For Marvin personally, the ordeal left a deep scar. He hated the invasion of privacy and resented the way his personal life became a public circus. He grew even more wary of relationships and more determined to live life on his own terms, without letting anyone else get close enough to cause that kind of trouble again. Lee Marvin wasn't just known for his unforgettable movie roles. Off-screen, he built a reputation that was just as wild, if not even wilder. The stories surrounding his personal life turned into legends, painting him as a man who lived hard, partied harder, and never played by anyone's rules but his own. First, let's talk about his drinking habits. Marvin's love of alcohol wasn't exactly a secret in Hollywood. In fact, it became almost as famous as his acting career. He would show up at bars and taverns, sometimes drinking entire crowds under the table. His favorite watering holes knew him by name, and bartenders braced themselves when Marvin walked through the door. There are tales of him getting into full-blown bar fights, then laughing it off the next day as just another night out. One famous incident involved Marvin and legendary actor John Wayne, two giants of Hollywood, getting into a heated, drunken argument that nearly ended in blows before dissolving into a laughing fit. It was chaos, but it was Lee Marvin's kind of chaos. Then there were the fights. Marvin wasn't just a tough guy on screen, he lived it in real life too. Barroom brawls, street scuffles, and sudden confrontations were practically a regular occurrence. And unlike some stars who cultivated a tough image but lived quietly, Marvin embraced the madness. He often joked that if he wasn't getting into a scrap every few weeks, he must be doing something wrong. But Marvin's rough edges weren't all about bravado. Those close to him described a man with a deeply complicated soul. Beneath the hard-drinking, fight-picking exterior was someone wrestling with personal demons and perhaps a sense of not quite fitting into the polished, fake world of Hollywood. He hated pretension, despised phoniness, and refused to play the industry's political games. This earned him as many enemies as it did admirers, but Marvin didn't seem to care. He was willing to burn bridges if it meant staying true to himself. Women, too, found themselves drawn to Marvin's rugged charisma. His relationship, however, were often turbulent and messy. Friends said that while Marvin could be incredibly charming one moment, he could turn moody and volatile the next. His unpredictability was part of what made him so magnetic and so dangerous. Perhaps the most telling part of Marvin's wild reputation was how he viewed fame itself. He never seemed to be chasing celebrity the way so many of his peers did. To him, fame was a byproduct of doing what he loved, not the goal. That rare attitude made him an outsider in an industry obsessed with image and attention. Marvin wanted to live life on his own terms, even if that meant leaving a trail of broken relationships, smashed bar stools, and unforgettable stories behind him. Despite Lee Marvin's rough-and-tumble reputation, there was a side of him that very few people ever got to see, a deeply loyal, surprisingly tender heart that surfaced when it mattered most. For all his bar fights, drinking sprees, and rebellious antics, Marvin showed time and time again that loyalty wasn't just a word to him. It was a way of life. One of the clearest examples came through his relationships with his friends. Marvin wasn't the type to cultivate shallow Hollywood connections just to climb the ladder. Instead, he formed bonds with a small circle of trusted companions, many of whom came from outside the industry altogether. These friendships often lasted decades, and Marvin was known to go out of his way to help his buddies, whether they were struggling financially, dealing with personal issues, or simply needed someone to lean on. If you were in Lee's inner circle, you could count on him, no matter what kind of chaos was swirling around. Another powerful example of Marvin's loyalty came from his military service. Even after becoming a major Hollywood star, he never once bragged about his time in the Marines. He kept quiet about the battles he fought and the scars he carried, physical and emotional, because he believed that the real heroes were the men who didn't make it home. When opportunities arose for him to use his fame to advocate for veterans' causes, he didn't hesitate. He showed up, donated money, and spoke out, even when it wasn't fashionable to do so. For Marvin, honoring his fallen brothers wasn't a photo op, it was a duty. Marvin's loyalty also extended into his romantic relationships, complicated though they often were. Even after messy breakups and public scandals, he didn't badmouth his former partners. In fact, when asked about his rocky love life, Marvin often took responsibility for his own failings rather than blaming others. It was a rare kind of honesty in a town where finger-pointing was the norm. Perhaps most surprisingly, Marvin remained fiercely loyal to his artistic principles throughout his career. He refused to sell out or take roles just for a paycheck. If he didn't believe in a project, he'd walk away, even if it meant burning bridges with powerful producers or missing out on big paydays. This stubborn commitment to authenticity earned him tremendous respect among his peers, even if it made him a nightmare for studio executives. One story that perfectly sums up Marvin's loyalty involves a lesser-known actor he once worked with early in his career. Years later, when that actor hit hard times and struggled to find work, Marvin quietly pulled strings behind the scenes to get him hired for a small but meaningful role without ever taking credit for it. To Marvin, loyalty wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about doing the right thing, quietly and consistently, no matter who was watching. Just when it seemed like Lee Marvin had managed to escape Hollywood's most brutal scandals, an unexpected legal battle erupted that would place him right in the center of a media firestorm. And unlike the fights he was used to, the bar brawls and on-set arguments, this was a battle fought in courtrooms, with reputations and fortunes on the line. It all began with his longtime companion, Michelle Triola. The two had lived together for 6 years during the 1960s, sharing a home, a lifestyle, and in many ways a life, but without ever officially tying the knot. When the relationship ended, Michelle didn't walk away quietly. Instead, she filed a lawsuit against Marvin, claiming she was entitled to financial support similar to what a divorced spouse would receive, despite the fact they had never married. This groundbreaking case would later be known as the famous palimony suit, a blend of pal and alimony, and it rocked not just Hollywood, but the entire country. No one had ever heard of such a thing before. The very idea that someone could claim spousal rights without ever having been espoused was explosive, and with Marvin's name attached to it, the headlines practically wrote themselves. Lee Marvin, who had always been fiercely private about his personal life, suddenly found every detail of his relationship dissected in public. His rough, macho image only fueled the media frenzy. How could a tough guy like Lee Marvin get dragged into a messy courtroom drama over domestic matters? Paparazzi hounded him, reporters speculated endlessly, and the public couldn't get enough. Inside the courtroom, the battle was bitter and ugly. Michelle claimed that Marvin had promised to support her for life, that she had sacrificed her own career to care for him, and that she deserved a significant financial settlement. Marvin's defense pushed back hard, arguing that no such promises had been made and that without a legal marriage, there were no grounds for her claims. The case dragged on for years, creating a circus-like atmosphere that Marvin hated. But underneath his gruff exterior, those close to him said he took the ordeal very personally. He felt betrayed, not just by Triola, but by the entire system that seemed eager to tear him down for entertainment. Friends said the lawsuit hardened him, making him even more wary of trusting people. In the end, Michelle Triola was awarded $104,000, far less than she had initially sought, but still a shocking outcome at the time. More importantly, the case set a legal precedent that would ripple through American law for decades, fundamentally changing the way cohabiting relationships were viewed in the eyes of the court. For Marvin, it was a brutal, humiliating experience, but he never let it break him. He refused to play the victim, refused to whine or complain publicly. He simply took the hit, dusted himself off, and kept moving forward. Lee Marvin's later years were marked by an unexpected shift, not in his career, but in how he chose to live. After decades of Hollywood chaos, the wild partying, the broken relationships, and the on-screen personas of tough, no-nonsense characters, Marvin began to retreat from the spotlight. For someone who had lived life at full throttle, it seemed like an odd decision. But in hindsight, it made perfect sense. It was during the 1980s that Marvin's life began to slow down. He wasn't completely absent for Hollywood, but the roles became fewer and the public sightings even rarer. Instead of hitting the club scene or taking on action-packed roles, he shifted toward more contemplative pursuits. He spent more time on his ranch in Arizona, focusing on his passion for horses and quietly enjoying his life away from the hustle of Hollywood. This new lifestyle seemed like a quiet rebellion against the very system that had made him famous. After all, Marvin had always been about defying expectations, both on and off screen. But this shift wasn't just about retreating into solitude. He was grappling with something deeper: his health. In the mid-1980s, Marvin was diagnosed with a serious health condition. It wasn't cancer, nor was it the result of his reckless lifestyle, but rather a culmination of years of wear and tear from his time in Hollywood and his earlier military service. He had always been tough, but his body was showing signs of age. His health deteriorated significantly in his final years, and he became a more reclusive figure. As his condition worsened, Marvin's final public appearances were few and far between. He made an appearance at the 1987 Academy Awards, where he received an honorary Oscar for his work in the industry. It was a bittersweet moment, as the recognition came at a time when Marvin was far from the robust action star he had once been. The applause and the celebration felt hollow compared to the man who had once walked the red carpet with swagger. In the years leading up to his passing in 1987, Lee Marvin had become a figure of nostalgia. Fans continued to remember him as the gritty, rough-around-the-edges star who had captivated audiences with his charisma and strength. But his personal transformation, moving away from the Hollywood lifestyle, left an indelible mark on those who had watched him grow. Those who knew Marvin will say that, despite the trials of his life, he found a sense of peace in his final years. He had, in many ways, found what he had been searching for all along: not fame, not fortune, but a quiet, fulfilling existence. As the years went by, Lee Marvin's quiet life became a topic of intrigue for those who had followed his career. But there was one final mystery surrounding the actor that few had ever guessed, one that would remain concealed until after his passing. It's a secret that, when revealed, would forever change how fans viewed the tough guy with a heart of gold. Lee Marvin's last secret wasn't something directly related to his career or his relationships. It wasn't a forgotten treasure trove of memorabilia or an unreleased film. Instead, it was something much more personal, something that lay in his private life, hidden from public view. Marvin had always been known as a man of extremes, a Hollywood star who lived life on his terms, pushing boundaries, challenging the system. But as his health declined and the spotlight dimmed, Marvin began to confront a deeper aspect of himself that he had long buried: his connection to his military past. For those who didn't know, Marvin was a Marine during World War II. He had seen the horrors of combat firsthand, and it had changed him in ways that he often refused to talk about. It was a side of Marvin that was rarely discussed in the press or even among close friends. But in his final years, those wounds, both physical and psychological, began to resurface in unexpected ways. In the months before his passing, Marvin revealed something to a few close friends. He confessed that the trauma from his time in the military had haunted him throughout his life. While many assumed his hard-edged persona was simply the result of his film career, it was actually a coping mechanism for the pain he had carried from the war. But there was more. In the final months of his life, Marvin made a bold decision. He sought out a therapist, something that was unheard of for someone of his stature and era. He began working through the psychological scars that had shaped his identity, those moments of fear, loss, and the burden of survival. It was a surprising step for someone who had always been the strong, silent type. However, Marvin's battle with his past didn't end there. Before his death, he made one final request, that his military service records and personal journals be sealed for a certain period of time. He didn't want the public to know everything about the inner turmoil he had lived with, especially after years of presenting himself as the quintessential tough guy. The request was granted, and his story remained untold for years. It wasn't until decades later, after his death, that the truth finally came to light. Researchers and biographers who had access to his personal records uncovered Marvin's intimate reflections on the war and his struggles with PTSD. The revelation shocked many. Lee Marvin, the hard-as-nails action hero, had fought a far different kind of battle behind closed doors. The secret of Marvin's hidden pain humanized him in ways that hadn't been possible while he was alive. Fans and admirers alike began to see him not just as a legend of the silver screen, but as a man who had endured personal battles far beyond what anyone could imagine. This final revelation reshaped the legacy of Lee Marvin, adding a layer of vulnerability to the man who had always been seen as indestructible. He had spent his life hiding the scars of his past, but in his last years, he chose to face them head-on. It was a decision that reflected the complexity of the man behind the iconic roles, a true revelation that not only completed his story, but transformed how we understand his remarkable journey. As we wrap up the untold truth behind Lee Marvin, we're left with a new perspective on the man who captivated audiences with his unforgettable performances. Beyond the tough guy persona, Marvin was a deeply complex individual, facing battles both on and off the screen. His legacy is not just built on his iconic roles, but on the hidden struggles he bravely confronted in his later years. Let this story remind us that everyone, no matter how tough they appear, has a deeper side. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more intriguing stories.